The greenhouse had not been opened in 11 months. Edmund, Duke of Renfield, stood before it in the grey morning of late February, and knew this because the key had hung untouched on the iron hook in the head gardener's cottage since the day the family had received the news. He knew it the way he knew every neglected corner of the estate, now by the specific accusing quality of disuse, the layer of unlived-in silence that had settled over Renfield Park in the months since his return from the continent, as if the house itself were still deciding whether to receive him. He had come back in November. He had spent 12 weeks walking these grounds in the cold, speaking to no one, unless necessary, signing documents Hartwell placed before him, dismissing his mother's suggestions about the spring season, with a quiet finality she had learned not to challenge. He had done all of this because it was what a man in his position did when his wife was dead. You returned, you managed, you continued, because continuing was the only act of will still available to you. The greenhouse had been built by his father's father, a man of scientific temperament who had grown orchids and pineapples and kept meticulous records of germination. The key was still on the hook. Edmund had looked at it every morning when he visited Thomas Marsh for his daily account of the estate, and every morning he had left it alone because something in him did not want to walk into a glass room that Cecily had loved and find only cold air. He was walking the east grounds this morning because he could not sleep, and the house felt too full of his own thoughts. The sky was that particular English white that promised neither sun nor rain, but only continuation. The bare ash trees along the kitchen garden wall standing in their winter patience. He had been walking for perhaps an hour when he noticed the light. Not the gray reflected light of cloud on glass. This was warmer, steadier, a glow that belonged to a room occupied, not a room abandoned. He stood 30 feet from the greenhouse door and watched the light for a long moment. His breath moved in the cold air. Something in his chest turned over, slow and enormous, the way ice turns in a river in early thaw, and he did not immediately understand what it was. He went to Thomas's cottage first. The old man was at his bench, his hands around a mug of tea, and when Edmund opened the door without knocking, Thomas Marsh did not startled, which was itself a thing. He looked at Edmund with an expression Edmund had not seen before on his face. Not guilt precisely, but something adjacent to it. "Something braced, your grace," Thomas said. "The greenhouse," Edmund said. "The key is on the hook." "The greenhouse is lit. Explain it to me." Thomas set down his mug. His hands, broad and work-darkened, rested flat on the bench. He was 73 years old and had served the Renfield estate since Edmund's father was a boy, and Edmund had never once seen him uncertain of what to say until this moment. Thomas said carefully that your grace ought to open the door and see for himself. The key was heavy and old, the iron warm from its hook. Edmund walked back across the kitchen garden in the white February morning, his footsteps the only sound. He fit the key into the lock. The tumblers turned with the particular authority of a lock that had been turned recently and regularly and not at all neglected. He pushed open the door. The air that came out was warm and green-scented, the breath of growing things in the dead of winter. The long trestle tables ran the length of the greenhouse, as they always had their clay pots ranged in the patient order Thomas kept, and at the far end where the heating pipes ran beneath the stone floor, and the orchids his great-grandfather had cultivated still put forth their improbable colors. She was tall and slight in a dark wool dress that was not one Edmund recognized. Her hair was pinned up but loosely, a few dark strands coming free at the nape of her neck. She was holding a small leather-bound journal, and she was very still. And for one suspended second, Edmund thought he had crossed into some fever of grief, some production of want and sleeplessness, that his exhausted mind had generated to give him what he could not stop needing. Then she turned, Cecily. Her eyes found his across the length of the greenhouse, and did not move away. She was thinner than he remembered. There was something in her face that had not been there before. Not hardness, but a settled quality, the look of a person who had made many decisions alone and knew herself capable of making more. She held the journal against her chest, as if she had been caught in the middle of a private thought and had chosen not to put it down. "Edmund," she said. Her voice was steady. It was the voice of someone who had decided some time ago that whatever happened next, she would not collapse in front of it. He could not speak. The warm green air was in his lungs, and the woman his family had buried was looking at him across a room full of living things, and the only word he had access to was her name. "Cecily," he said. It came out very quietly. Neither of them moved. The light through the glass was the winter light, pale, without warmth's full weight, and it fell across her face the way it always had, catching the dark of her hair and the pallor of her skin. And Edmund was aware of a sensation in his chest that was not grief and not relief, but something that preceded both of those, something older and more fundamental. As if a mechanism that had been stopped for 11 months had simply resumed. He did not cross the room. She did not move toward him. They stood in the space between, the green scent of the greenhouse around them, and looked at one another. "You are alive," he said at last. "I am," she said. "I have been here." He needed to hear how, and she was not yet ready to tell him. That was the first thing he understood. Cecily had arrived at Renfield Park as Edmund's wife in the March of the previous year, following a wedding conducted at her father's estate in Somerset, a quiet affair. Her father already ill, the family's finances so reduced that the speed of the match had been, on her side, a mercy as much as a romance. She was 23 years old, and she had been in her own careful estimation neither foolish nor naive about what she was entering. The Duke of Renfield was 32, recently returned from his first posting abroad, a man of measured speech and a reputation for honor, and she had liked him. She had liked him genuinely, a thing she had not expected to be able to say of a man she had known for 4 months before the vows were spoken. The house had been the difficulty, not the house itself, which was beautiful in the way that very old things made for a specific purpose are beautiful, every proportion correct, every room serving the function for which it was built. The difficulty was the woman who had ruled it for 20 years, and did not intend to stop. Leonora, the Dowager Duchess of Renfield, was 57 years old, with fair hair gone to silver, and the particular kind of composure that did not soften under any social pressure, because she had never required softening. She had managed the estate through her husband's long illness, and after his death, had raised Edmund and Aldous with the disciplined efficiency of a woman who understood that duty was the only reliable currency in a world of contingencies. And she received Cecily into Renfield Park with a welcome so precisely calibrated that it took Cecily 3 weeks to identify what was wrong with it. There was nothing wrong with any specific sentence. The wrongness lived in the aggregate. She was never suited to this family, Leonora had said to Aldous, a week before Edmund sailed for Portugal. Cecily had not been meant to hear it. She was crossing the gallery above the drawing room when her mother-in-law's voice came up through the ceiling of the room below, clear in the way voices carry in old houses when the speaker does not believe herself heard. Her family is respectable but not significant. Her manner is agreeable but not commanding. Edmund made a sentiment-driven choice in a season of poor judgment. It will be managed. Cecily had stood still on the gallery floor and let the words settle into her, the way cold settles into stone walls. She had not gone in to dinner that night until she was certain her face was her own again. Edmund sailed in April. He had not wanted to go. He had been recalled, which was a different thing. He held her hands at the door of the house and said, "I will write every week," and she believed him. She wrote back. She wrote 7 letters in the first 2 months, each one careful and warm and full of the small details of the house and grounds she thought he might wish to hear. None of the letters she received in return seemed to reference anything she had written, which she attributed to the irregularity of the post. In July, she lost the child. The labor was early and violent, and she did not emerge from it clearly for 3 days. And when she did, Leonora was seated at her bedside with the expression of a woman delivering a judgment she had expected to have to deliver. "You will recover," Leonora said. "You are young. These things happen. The family's physician believes there may be a structural concern that would make a second attempt inadvisable. She paused. The matter will not be bruited about. Cicely, who was still weak, and whose hands did not feel like her own, asked to see the child. That is not possible, Leonora said. The child was removed. It was the merciful course. You are to rest, and when you are recovered, we will discuss arrangements. She came to understand the arrangements over the following weeks, as she grew stronger, and Leonora's visits grew more deliberate. Edmund had not responded to her letter telling him of the lying in. Leonora explained with a precision that Cicely found, later she could replay word for word, that Edmund had been informed and had agreed that the most sensible course was for Cicely to return to Somerset for her recovery, and that Aldous would manage the transition. Aldous, who was 28 and ambitious in the way of younger brothers who have always had proximity to power without access to it, confirmed this in a conversation in the library that September. He was standing at the window with his back to her when he said it. You must understand that your position in this family has always been contingent, he said. Edmund is fond of you, and that will not change. Edmund is practical, and the family's requirements are clear. She was never suited to this family. I am not saying so to be cruel, only to be honest. The estate requires an heir. The physician has spoken. There are arrangements that would be more comfortable for everyone, including you. Cicely looked at his back and felt something in her go very still, the way water goes still before ice forms. What arrangements? She said. And he told her. The asylum he named was in Derbyshire. It was, he said, a private and comfortable establishment. It was not a punishment. It was a sensible solution to an unfortunate situation. It would allow the family to pursue more appropriate arrangements without public difficulty. He said all of this without turning from the window, and when he finished, the room was very quiet. She left the house on a Tuesday night, in late October. 3 weeks later, in the rain, she took her jewel case and 2 gowns and the letters she had received from Edmund. She had kept all of them, and the small sewing scissors from her work-basket. She was not sure where she was going when she began. She went to the greenhouse because it was unlocked, and because it was warm, and because it was not the house. Thomas found her on Wednesday morning. He was a man who had seen a great deal of life, in the particular way that people who work the land and watch the seasons see it, which is to say, without surprise at the range of what human beings do to one another. He brought her bread and a candle. He asked no questions. She was not ready to answer. He locked the door from the outside and hung the key on the hook in his cottage, where it had always hung, which meant no one would think to look for it, because everyone would assume it meant the greenhouse was empty. When the family reported her drowned, a carriage accident on the road to Somerset, they said, a wheel gone at the river bridge. Thomas said nothing. He brought her food in the early mornings before the household was awake. He brought her candles and paper, and a blanket, and eventually, as winter closed in, the iron stove that had heated the seating room. He brought her the letters, too, the ones addressed to her in Edmund's hand that had arrived and been intercepted since October. There were 4 of them. She read each one several times in the greenhouse light, and kept them folded inside the back cover of the journal. She had begun keeping the week of her arrival. She had written everything down. The dates, the conversations as exactly as she could remember them, the physician's precise words, the name of the asylum in Derbyshire, the letters she had sent and the letters she had received, and the 4 letters that had arrived and been kept from her. She did not know why she was writing it down at the time. She thought perhaps it was because writing was the one thing that felt like action when action was not available to her. The one way to insist that she existed, and that what had been done to her was real. She had been in the greenhouse for 4 months when Edmund's ship docked at Portsmouth. She had been there for 11 when he opened the door. He did not demand explanations in the first hour. He sat at the potting bench across from her and listened. And she told him some of it. The asylum, the family's plan, Thomas's quiet loyalty, in the careful, level voice she had developed across 11 months of solitude. She watched his face while she spoke. She had always been good at reading faces, and Edmund's was not difficult to read, though he believed it was. The muscle in his jaw worked once, twice, when she named the asylum. His hands, resting on the bench, did not move. "The drowning report," he said when she stopped. "I do not know who arranged the specific story," she said. "I was told nothing. I learned of it from Thomas, who heard it from the housekeeper, who had been informed by your brother Edmund." Was quiet for a long moment. The heating pipes beneath the floor made their low sound, and the orchids around them were indifferent and patient and extraordinarily alive. "Why did you not come to me?" he said, and then heard himself and stopped. She looked at him steadily. "You were not here," she said, "and when I wrote to tell you I was in difficulty, the letters were returned to your mother." She paused. "I believed, for some time, that you had chosen not to respond. Your mother was quite clear about the nature of your response. He was aware of something happening in his body that was not comfortable, a heat behind his eyes, a tightening in the throat that he identified with some effort as the physical sensation of understanding what he had allowed, through absence, to be done. The awareness of where he was standing in her skin. "I will move you to the Dower cottage this evening," he said. "Thomas will see to it. You will not sleep another night in this greenhouse." She held the journal more firmly. "I have been comfortable here," she said, "and I am not certain the main house is safe for me until I understand what you intend." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in 11 months. He recognized it as such, and "I intend," he said, with the slow, deliberate clarity of a man choosing his words as carefully as he had ever chosen anything, "that what was done to you will not stand. I intend to understand the full extent of it, and I intend that you will not be afraid of this estate. Or of me. What I am asking is that you give me time to demonstrate that." She looked at him a long time. Then she looked down at the journal in her hands, and then back at him. And she said nothing, which was, he recognized, not a refusal. He moved her to the Dower cottage that night, under a sky full of early stars, Thomas walking ahead with a lantern and saying nothing to anyone. The next 4 days were not comfortable days, but they had the quality of something genuine. Edmund questioned the housekeeper, the footman who had been on duty in October, the groom who had ridden with the physician. He sent for Hartwell, the family solicitor, on the pretense of reviewing the estate accounts. He moved through the main house with the quietness of a man who had learned, on 2 campaigns, that the best reconnaissance was the kind no one noticed. His mother received him at dinner the first evening with the perfect composure of a woman who had no reason to believe she was being examined. She inquired after his health. She mentioned, with a delicacy so refined as to be nearly invisible, that Lady Priscilla Hartborn and her family would be in the neighborhood by March, should Edmund wish to receive callers in the spring. She said nothing about the greenhouse. Aldous was less composed. He appeared in the library on the second morning, uninvited, and stood at the window in the way he had always stood when he was controlling something in his face. "I understand you have been spending time in the east grounds," Aldous said. "I find the air restorative," Edmund said without looking up from the accounts. "The greenhouse has been locked since October," Aldous said. "Has it?" Edmund said. There was a pause. "She was never suited to this family," Aldous said, the words arriving with the precision of something that had been rehearsed, or perhaps simply repeated so many times it had become reflexive. "Whatever you believe you may have found, or whatever old Marsh may have suggested, a man of his age, his mind is not what it was." Cecily was disordered in her grief over the child. The physician documented it. The decision to pursue alternative arrangements was made in the family's best interest, and in hers. Edmund put down the accounts and looked at his brother. "You will say nothing further on the subject," he said, "until I ask you to." Aldous left the library. Edmund sat alone in it for a long time. On the third evening, he walked to the Dower cottage, as the light was failing. He had not announced himself, because he had been across the lane returning the ledgers to the steward's office when he heard the sound, a low, clear, feminine voice, singing something slow and without ornamentation, the kind of song that was not meant for an audience. He stopped walking through the cottage window, Lit by the lamp on the table, he could see Cecily, seated in the chair by the fire. Thomas's granddaughter, Nettie, was on her lap, a child of 4, dark-haired like her grandfather, who had been ill with a cough for a week and was now curled against Cecily's chest in the complete and absolute way that children sleep when they are recovering. Cecily was not looking at anything in particular. Her hand moved in a slow pattern on the child's back, and she sang something that Edmund could not quite hear through the glass, and her face had none of the watchful, braced quality it held when he was in the room. What it held instead was this: patience, care, the settled attentiveness of a person doing the only thing required of them in this moment. And finding it sufficient, he stood outside the window for perhaps 2 minutes. He did not knock. He turned and walked back across the lane and stood in the cold for a little while. He had come back from the continent a man in mourning, and mourning had a grammar he had learned to navigate, the expected silences, the expected forms, the way that grief, if it was performed correctly, became eventually indistinguishable from ordinary melancholy. He had believed, in some part of himself he had not examined directly, that what he mourned was an abstraction, a wife of 4 months, a beginning, a thing that might have become something had the world allowed. He had not permitted himself to mourn the specific person, because permitting that was a door he was not ready to open. He understood now, in the cold February lane, wrong about what he mourned. He turned and knocked. He gave her the letters the following morning, all 4 of them, retrieved from a drawer in his mother's sitting room that had not been locked, because Leonora had not believed anyone would look there. They were still sealed. He placed them on the table in the dower cottage, and Cecily looked at them for a moment, and then looked at him. "I wrote to you," she said. "Every week?" "I know," he said. "I received none of it after April." She opened the letters. He watched her read them, each one, in order, slowly, and saw what passed across her face in the reading. He did not look away, though there was a part of him that wanted to. Watching her read the evidence of what she had been denied felt like the correct form of penance. When she finished, she set them down and picked up the journal. She held it for a long moment, and then she extended it to him. "Read the entries from the library," she said. From the 15th of September, he read. The journal was small and closely written, the hand precise and clear, and what he read in it was the record of a mind that had been systematically misinformed and had nonetheless maintained its own accuracy, naming what happened with the exactness of a person who understood that her account might someday matter, who was preserving the truth of events against someone else's efforts to replace it with a more convenient story. He read the library conversation with Aldous, in its entirety, the words recorded as close to verbatim as memory allowed, with Cecily's own marginal note beside them, in her small, precise hand, that she had written them the same evening. He read the physician's conversation, and the record of the 4 letters received, and their contents. He read the final entry, dated 2 days before Edmund opened the greenhouse door. "Thomas says the estate is quiet." She had written, "Edmund has been walking the grounds in the mornings. I do not know what I will do if he opens the door. I do not know what I will do if he does not." Edmund became aware that his hand had moved very slightly toward hers where it rested on the table. He became aware of this because his hand had stopped itself, half extended, the instinct to reach, and the knowledge that he had not yet earned the reach, arriving simultaneously and creating a stillness in his body that cost him something to hold. He did not complete the motion. He set the journal down. "Cecily," he said, and then stopped, because what he wanted to say was not something that could be rushed into the space of a single morning. "I know," she said quietly. She was not looking at him, but at the letters on the table. "I believed for a long time that you knew about the interception, that you had simply chosen to, that your silence was a choice." She paused. "Reading these, I understand that you did not know." "No," he said. "I did not." "But you left," she said. It was not an accusation. It was the simple bare fact of it, laid between them with neither anger nor complaint. "I left," he said. He did not qualify it. He did not explain that he had been recalled, because she knew that, and it was not the full truth of what he was answering. The full truth was that he had left her alone in a house ruled by his mother, and he had not looked carefully enough at what that house was before he went. She was quiet for a time. The fire in the hearth made its small sounds. "You had a child," he said. "I did not know." "A girl," Cecily said. "I was not permitted to hold her." Her voice remained even, but something in it changed register, a slight deepening, the way a river deepens without visibly widening. "Your mother told me the physician believed she could not have survived, even had everything proceeded normally. I do not know if that is true. There was nothing to say to this that was adequate. He did not attempt anything inadequate. Well, there will be an accounting," he said, "of all of it." "Yes," she said. "I believe there will." She looked at him, then directly. With the specific quality of gaze she had always had, the look that saw a thing as it was, rather than as it presented itself. "I am not yet sure what I want that accounting to look like," she said. "I have had 11 months to think about what I want, and I am still not certain of the shape of it. I want to be the one who decides." "You will be," he said. He meant it in the full sense of the words, and she heard it. The blow came on the 5th morning. Edmund was in the library reviewing the last of the accounts when his mother appeared, in the doorway with a man he recognized, the physician, Peel from Bath, who specialized in nervous disorders of women and who had a particular relationship with several of the county's better families. Aldous was behind him. "Edmund," his mother said. She advanced into the library with the composure of a woman who had planned this maneuver carefully, and believed she had timed it well. "I think you have been bearing a great deal alone these past days, and I am concerned for you, Doctor. Peel has come to assess the situation at the Dower Cottage." "There is nothing at the Dower Cottage that requires assessment," Edmund said. "There is a woman at the Dower Cottage who has been living in a greenhouse for nearly a year," Leonora said. "Whatever she has told you, Edmund and I do not doubt. She has told you a great many things. You must consider the state of her mind. The physician in October was quite clear. This is a kindness, not a judgment. She was never suited to this family." Aldous said. He was standing at Leonora's shoulder, and he said it with the flat certainty of a man who had said it so many times that it had ceased to be a weapon and become simply the way things were. "The family has a responsibility to manage the situation properly, and the situation has been managed. A woman who invents conspiracies and chooses to hide in a garden outbuilding rather than accept reasonable care is not well." Edmund looked at his mother. He looked at his brother. He looked at the physician, who had the good grace to appear uncomfortable. He looked at the door to the corridor, where Cecily now stood. She had come up from the Dower Cottage. For what reason he did not know. Whether Thomas had sent word. Whether she had seen the carriage arrive. She was in the doorway of the library in her dark wool dress, her journal under her arm, her face holding the braced and settled quality that he now knew was the face she showed the world when she had decided to show it nothing else. She looked at Leonora. She looked at Aldous. She looked at the physician. Then she set the journal on the hall table outside the door and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "I see." She turned and walked toward the entrance of the house. Edmund became aware, in the space of the 3 seconds it took Cecily to cross the hall, that he was at a crossroads of a kind that did not announce itself in advance, but was nonetheless absolute. He had hesitated. 1 second, 2. The machine of family loyalty and social form, and the trained instinct to manage rather than confront, had run its familiar course through him. And in those 2 seconds, Cecily had understood everything she needed to understand about where he stood. He moved. He crossed the library in 4 strides. He picked up the journal from the hall table, and he went past the physician, and past his mother, and past Aldous, and through the entrance hall toward the front door, which was open. In the hall coming through the entrance from the drive was Mr. Hartwell, who had arrived precisely when Edmund had asked him to arrive, and behind him 2 figures Edmund had not anticipated, Sir Robert Ashcroft, the county magistrate, who was also an old friend of Edmund's father, and Lady Castlemar, who was at 70 the most senior figure in the county's social hierarchy, and who had been Cecily's godmother's closest friend and who did not, in Edmund's experience, travel anywhere without a purpose. Cecily had stopped at the top of the front steps. Edmund came through the entrance hall and placed himself beside her. He turned to face the doorway into the hall, through which Leonora and Aldous and the physician had now followed. He opened the journal and offered it to Hartwell. The solicitor took it. "Read from the 15th of September entry," Edmund said. "Then read the letters on the table in the Dower cottage. They are her letters to me. Return to my mother's drawer. And my letters to her. Never delivered." He paused. "The death report was filed in November. I will want to understand who signed it." Leonora had gone very still. It was a different kind of stillness than her usual composure, not the stillness of a woman who had control of a room, but the stillness of a woman watching the architecture of a carefully constructed structure discover that its load-bearing wall was gone. "Edmund," she began. He turned to look at her. He did not speak. Aldous took a half-step forward. "Whatever the woman has told you, whatever she has written, the physician's documentation, my wife is alive," Edmund said. His voice was level and unhurried, and he did not raise it. "She stays. You are finished here." The hall was very quiet. He had not addressed his mother. He had addressed the room. He said it with the specific procedural authority of a duke in the house of his dukedom, in front of a solicitor and a magistrate and Lady Castlemar, who was now regarding Aldous with an expression of such composed displeasure that Aldous seemed to diminish slightly where he stood. The old lady said very quietly, "Good God, Leonora." Leonora's fan held that its perpetual measured height was no longer quite steady. She looked at Edmund. She looked at Cecily. She looked at the journal in Hartwell's hands. Something moved across her face that was not quite recognition and not quite regret, but was the beginning of understanding what she had built and what it had cost, and something in her posture acknowledged, for the first time in 20 years, that the room had rendered its verdict, and it was not her verdict. "The letters," she said at last very quietly. "Yes," Edmund said, "the letters." Aldous did not speak again. He had the look of a man who had played a hand he believed was unbeatable and was watching it lose. Hartwell had begun to read. Edmund turned to Cecily. She was standing very still at the top of the steps, her hands folded before her, her face entirely her own. Not the braced face, not the watchful face, but something underneath both of those. Something that was simply Cecily, 24 years old, alive and here, and looking at him. She had heard the line. He saw in her face that she had heard it. She did not speak. She looked at him for a long moment in the cold February light, and then she walked back through the entrance hall, past Aldous, and past her mother-in-law, and past the physician who was trying very hard to be invisible. And she retrieved her journal from Hartwell's hands. Edmund followed her. It was not resolved in a single afternoon. It was resolved over the weeks that followed, in the patient and procedural way that such things resolve when the evidence is clear and the authority to act is uncontested. Hartwell examined the letters and the journal and the physician's documentation, and produced, in a measured fortnight, his own accounting of the events of the previous autumn. Sir Robert Ashcroft had a conversation with Aldous that was never reported in its specifics, but after which Aldous removed himself to his own establishment in Lincolnshire and did not correspond with the main house. The physician from Bath returned to Bath. Leonora remained at Renfield Park. This was Cecily's decision, offered with the directness that Edmund had come to expect from her. "She is an old woman," Cecily said, "whose son came home. She will not trouble us again because she understands now that the estate's authority does not rest with her. Sending her away would be a cruelty that is not required." She paused. "And I want her to see that I am here." Edmund looked at her. "You are certain I am," she said. "It is the settlement I want." He had learned in the 5 weeks since the greenhouse that when Cecily said she was certain, The conversation was complete. Leonora moved to the dower house in March with her personal maid and her jewels, and her fan. She was received at the main house for Sunday dinners and spoke very little. If she had formed a private opinion of the situation, she kept it behind a composure so seamless it was no longer distinguishable from genuine peace, and possibly in the end it had become one. Cecily had the greenhouse. She kept the key herself now, on a ribbon hung from the latch of the morning-room window, and she went every day in the early afternoon when the light was best, and she kept her journal on the potting bench where she had kept it before. Thomas continued to tend the beds. Nutty, fully recovered from her cough, occasionally accompanied him, and could sometimes be found at the low work table near the heating pipes, drawing pictures of the orchids with a charcoal pencil Cecily had given her. Edmund had come, in the weeks since February, to understand something about what it meant to be grateful in a way that was not simple and was not comfortable. He had come to understand that the gratitude was not for the second chance, though he felt that too. The gratitude was for the woman, specifically, for the specific quality of mind that had written everything down, kept the letters safe, survived 11 months of cold and silence and uncertainty, and emerged from it with her accuracy intact. He had not yet told her this in those exact terms. He was working up to it in the manner of a man who understood that the words, if they were to be true rather than merely sincere, needed to arrive at their own pace. He found her in the greenhouse on a Tuesday, in the second week of April, in the late afternoon when the light came through the glass at the angle that filled the room with something approaching warmth. The orchids were in their unreasonable bloom. Nettie was asleep on the low stool in the corner, her charcoal pencil in her hand, her drawing unfinished in her lap. Cecily was at the potting bench, with her journal open, writing. She looked up when he came in. "You are early," she said. "I finished the accounts," he said. He came down the length of the greenhouse and stood at the end of the bench, and she closed the journal and looked at him in a particular way she had directly, without performance. "Hogwell says the documentation is complete," he said. "Everything is on record. There are no remaining questions about your position or your status." "I know," she said. "He wrote to me." "Yes," Edmund said. He would have. He was aware, as he had been aware on the lane outside the cottage window and in the library with the journal in his hands, of exactly where she was in the room, in the way that one is aware of the sun's position, not by looking but by the quality of warmth on one side of the face. He was aware that the space between them, across the potting bench, was not very large, and that they had spent 5 weeks in the careful and courteous process of allowing it to become smaller, one honest conversation at a time. She was looking at him with the look that saw things as they were. "Edmund," she said. It was the first time she had used his name with ease in it, rather than with the slight formal distance she had been giving it since February, and he heard the difference. "You know." She stood from the bench and reached past the orchid pots to the long iron handle of the ventilation panel above her, and she pushed it open. The evening air came in, cool still, but different from winter's cold, carrying the smell of the turned kitchen garden beds and the early grass and the particular quality of April in the English countryside, which is the smell of things returning. "Edmund," she said again simply. He crossed to her side of the bench. He had not held her hand since the day he left for Portugal. He took it now. She did not pull away. She was looking at the open panel above them and the pale evening sky beyond it, and her hand in his had the particular steadiness of something that has been through a great deal and is still present. He said, her name, just that. Her given name, in the greenhouse, in the April light. As naturally as if he had been saying it all along. She turned her head and looked at him. Something in her face had released. Not the braced quality. Not the watchfulness. "Just Cecily, here. We will be all right," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "We will." Nettie stirred on her stool in the corner, and did not wake. Thomas was visible through the glass, making his slow way along the far beds, pausing now and then to examine something close to the soil. The orchids were indifferent to all of this, which was correct. The open panel above them let the evening air move through the warm room, the smell of April mixing with the greenhouse's green breath. The journal was on the bench. Cecily looked at it once, and then looked away. She had written everything down, and it had been sufficient. She did not need to look at it again. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. It helps more than you know. Thank you for being here.